Okay, also feel free to jump in at any point if you feel that you've got something to contribute. This is not going to be a systematic wrapping up of all the concerns that have been raised in the course of this conference, but just taking up some of the strands that we've assembled so far and basically taking a look at the different kinds of Kropotkin that we have encountered in the course of this conference. I'm not going to enumerate all of them, but we've seen Kropotkin as a thinker of adaptable concepts, I would say, already in our first panel, where Michael has shown us his account of perceptual sympathy and has argued that it preempts later theories of empathy that weren't even around at the time. So while he engages with questions and theories of his time, Michael also tried to convert them and transform them and bring them into conversation with current concepts. And Zoe showed us that this kind of adaptation may be particularly fitting for Kropotkin because his very definitions of his terms, his very definition of anarchism varies with the domain in which he is arguing at any given point. So he's a thinker who not only can be adapted, but he also adapts his own concepts on a constant basis, right? And the mutual aid panel, much later, has shown how Kropotkin, again, has been adapted in practice with all of the problems that come with that, as Claudia Firth has shown, and all the possibilities that lie in that, as Tom Putin has argued very forcefully. And also the final panel has taken up this strand of adaptation where we've seen that Kropotkin can still be leveraged against reductive evolutionary models, as Ola has shown, and he can be applied to new conceptions of non-human matter, which to some extent he stands against, but which he also seems to be sympathetic with. But adaptation has its limits, I think it's fair to say, we've also seen. Kropotkin has also very much emerged in this conference as a man of his time. Constance Bantman has drawn attention to the role of women in his circle, for example, which remains unacknowledged in many cases. Lee Dugatkin has shown us how much he's influenced by Lamarckian theories, which have been debunked ever since. Bennett Brazelton has shown us the blind spots in Kropotkin's account of humanity. And over again, we've seen some problems with the transitional phases in Kropotkin's thought. That very often he seems to think that this is a point on a progressive line of development where we, from our privileged vantage point, much later might say it wasn't, or it wasn't necessarily. So while we did see Kropotkin as a global thinker in Pascal Siegrist and Shangshan Wang's paper, for example, with global and transnational ambitions, and as a networked thinker, as Sean Pitt and Christopher Cockard and Soren Hugh have shown, also in his relationship with Mary Goldsmith, he is also very much a political actor of his time. I think that's also emerged. And that's also the one area, and I'll close with this, in which I think we've encountered the most strident critiques of Kropotkin in this conference, where Nikolai Gerasimov and especially Dmitry Ivanov have traced his political entanglements extensively, the applause he received from the right, and the disparagement he received from his anarchist peers, and as David Saunders argued, his dismissal of some motivations, of some motive courses, of some religious sentiments that might have been important for the behavior of people, but that he did not account for properly. So these are very different Kropotkins that we met here, very much in line with the remit of this conference, in which, and I quote here from our call for papers, we wanted to talk about 100 years with Kropotkin. Time and again, his concepts prove their worth for analysis and transformative action alike. Amidst the current ecological and economic crisis, Pyotr Kropotkin's immense body of work allows us to think across geography and the sciences, culture and politics, economy and ecology. His ethical and biological approach to social questions resonates with many of his contemporaries and continues to live on in the work of writers and activists. But as we face compounding crisis on an unprecedented scale, we are also, and that's another thing we stressed, without Kropotkin. This means that he cannot serve as an infallible guide to revolutionary thought and action. And instead of merely celebrating his work as a blueprint, our conference had the aim to suggest ways of adapting his varied thoughts, thinking about what might be relinquished, what might be something that was relevant at the time, but is no longer, refracting his thoughts, in a word, through different approaches and asking what Kropotkin has to tell us amidst the crises that we face today. So, with that slightly lengthy preamble, I would like to invite you all to contribute on the Kropotkin that seems to have emerged for you in this conference, maybe changes in the image of Kropotkin that you had before going into this conference, and also generally the legacy of his thought. So where are we with and without Kropotkin? I'd be very curious to know.
Yeah, I would say for me personally, just to start the conversation, I guess, a lot of these, I wouldn't say inconsistencies, but personal problems I would have with some of Kropotkin's opinions. You know, some of the anarcho-reformism we discussed, Woodall One, and also briefly touched on his views about homosexuality and also just sex in general. I think it's something that I not find it easy to forget, but almost try to forget, because I read a lot of Kropotkin's life. I want to like Kropotkin. Maybe not love him, maybe not think that he's infallible, but I want to like him. And there are very few people I like that would support World War One and be homophobic, obviously. And I think that speaks to kind of, in a more kind of like a broader sense, the way that we feel about like, I don't want to say heroes, but like people who we know that have been influential that we think are good, and also to the like intense fallibility of people, but especially people who were around 100 years ago, which I guess is kind of within the anarchist spirit, in that, you know, we shouldn't have any leaders, not even Kropotkin.
Yeah, no gods, no masters, not even the prince. I think that's preaching to the choir, but I agree. Yeah, and those are problems we encounter, and I think, but maybe that's also an advantage, you know, to an extent. That I don't know, that we don't have this one system that we adapt, like in the case of Marx, you know, but that we, you know, don't even fall into the trap of kind of over applying a theory in the first place, because we do encounter these problems of identification to an extent. Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, I agree with Sean, and I think, and this might be, I don't know if this is too optimistic, but I looking at Kropotkin and kind of his flaws, perhaps, in relation to how we view things now, 100 years later, it kind of fills me with a bit of optimism as well for anarchism, and I think that also relates to Ben's talk earlier this afternoon, where we were talking about, you know, the connection between anti-colonialism and anarchism, where I think we see now that contemporary anarchism is you know, more feminist. At least I hope so, at least for us here. And so the women being given less attention in his time, perhaps also still in the scholarship. That's something that's at least being combated. And the same goes for you know, queer rights in respect to Kropotkin's views. And I think you can already trace that back even further if you look at people like Proudhon and Bakunin, where the idea of anarchism sort of broadens from just fighting the state to including private property, to etc. etc. And so I think you, in a sense, you can then turn around and then connect that back to Kropotkin himself and say, well, Kropotkin talks about mutual aid kind of like a circle that keeps widening, and even if he hasn't, you know, he's always in his own time, so he can't just perfectly widen that circle to include everyone, perhaps, but we can see 100 years later that is something that does progress in a way, or at least I like to think that it is.
Yeah, I think so too. And I also, some of the discussions we had about like kind of national conceptions about, you know, the idea that France could be the cradle of the revolution, or that any country now could be like the cradle of the revolution. There are different times where we feel like there are movements in countries that are stronger or weaker that, you know, could be quite influential, important. But I feel like we've got this less national conception, and that therefore the left has become significantly more internationalist. compared to 100 years ago. And I know that we're talking about Kropotkin, but also I know that this is a big thing in the anarchist movement in general. I just thought of a funny story I know from that is that Max Nettlau, the anarchist historian, who's been mentioned once or twice in a few different papers, was a passionate Austrian and wrote a broad history of like all different European anarchist movements. And he completely ignored the Czech Republic because he thought that the Czechs weren't different to Austrians and that they were part of Austria and were too uppity. And so he just didn't write a history of them, and it had to be kind of reclaimed later on. And I feel like a lot of these questions kind of almost seem like kind of incredibly dated now, because I feel like we don't really have those, like, I'm British. I don't think about Britain changing. I wouldn't, it would be more convenient for me if it happened first here, if the world started to change from Britain first. But I much more conceive of it as an international thing in a way that I don't think Kropotkin did, and many of his contemporaries didn't either.
Ola, were you saying something? You're muted.
Okay. It's not here. Is Ben here in the chat, maybe, from the previous panel?
He looks to be, yes.
Yeah, okay. It's just you talked about how maybe anti-colonialism or decolonialism should be a priority before more explicitly anarchist struggle. And I just want to say, if you look for a paper, and you can find it freely online, by Uri Gordon, called National Anarchism and Nationalism, there you will find a quote that says that for Kropotkin, is a war against foreign oppression. So decolonial wars might take a removal of foreign domination was a precondition for social revolution, which I think is very much what Ben said. Did that make sense?
Dimitri?
From what I understand, one of major points that Kropotkin was making about the First World War was that it was Europe's duty to liberate, to protect small countries like Belgium and Serbia, and that's that's also probably kind of similar to maybe a form of anti-colonialism and stuff like that. And I don't know. I don't know how antiquated these kind of views are now. If we look at, I don't know, unsure how much of an anarchist Noam Chomsky is, but he's, he has a record of, defending some states against the imperial American power, and it's when that's also strange a little bit, coming up a little bit strange sometimes, like his defense of Cambodian regime in 1970s. Thank you.
I think that's interesting, because I always thought that some comparisons could be made between Kropotkin and Chomsky, and that I'm not sure if like the thing you mentioned specifically, actually, I'm not sure if Kropotkin would ever support that kind of thing. But this thing where as they get older, but also throughout their life, every now and then they've been accused of being not that left-wing and anarchist, kind of a more liberal end of the anarchist spectrum. It's something that kind of haunted both of their careers, but certainly more towards the end, I would say, of both individuals. And I say that as someone who was kind of converted to anarchism by Chomsky and discovered Kropotkin through Chomsky. But I certainly think those criticisms aren't completely without any validity.
I wonder too on that, Sean. how much of that is a wider kind of societal process that you generally see with political radicals, whereby the point at which they're no longer deemed to be a threat is the point at which they kind of like graduate into polite or acceptable society?
Yeah, maybe, but also apart from kind of the personal kind of movement rightwards, I do wonder whether the panel in which you were involved, Dimitri, and also Claudia Firth's paper kind of suggests that there might be something inherently adaptable to anarchism by the wrong people. I mean, that's not necessarily to criticize anarchism at all, because I mean they were always at great pains of setting themselves apart, right? But Claudia talked about these forms of netarchical capitalism, as she called it, and internalized managerialism, which kind of reappropriate and distort some of the rhetoric for their own ends, right? And we've got then in your paper, Dimitri, Kropotkin kind of League, which was kind of extremely liberal for the time, alien to anarchism, and apparently, I don't, maybe you disagree there or have other information, but apparently at the time he didn't see that as that much of an ideological contradiction, kind of being a member of the Federalist League and writing on anarchism still at the same time. So I was just wondering if there's something inherently, maybe dangerously adaptable to anarchism as well in this tradition.
I'm afraid that I've had to miss Claudia's paper, so I can't comment on that. And also another thing about adaptability of anarchist movement, anarchist thought, anarchist ideas is that for all of its numerous failures, it somehow still survives and has adherents and so on. And you can't say that about, I don't know, as far as, I don't know, Russian revolutionary history is concerned. You don't have modern day socialist revolutionaries in the same numbers as anarchists, and that was like the biggest pie in Russia in 1917. Or you don't have socialist revolutionary maximalists. You don't really have fans of Grigory Zinoviev as opposed to the Trotskyists, who were a minor faction in 1920s. But anyway, that adaptability kind of we will see more about anarchism of rocks and so on in the future, I guess. If we've heard about anarchism of mushrooms and plants, if I'm permitted to say so. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just adding to vaguely to what Dimitri said there, like kind of my PhD in history kind of focuses on the anarchist and liberal interactions. There have certainly been a few liberalisms that have been lost along the way. And the one I write about, new liberalism, has in a lot of ways just kind of disappeared and been subsumed into the kind of managerialism, but of neoliberal capitalism. But they're quite different, neoliberalism and new liberalism. So I think that you have a point in that anarchism has survived and continues to try to be ungovernable or unadaptable into capitalist hierarchical society, let's say. Yeah. I was going to say, go on, Billy. Sorry. I was going to go on to a different topic, so you keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it kind of like speaks a bit to what Corb was saying, and also apologies if you can hear really tinny EDM music coming from my speakers. It's my neighbour's garden. I'll lay my cards on the table. I'm a Marxist, I'm not an anarchist. And in terms of I don't want to like mischaracterize any anarchist theory that I don't know particularly well, but in terms of what Corb was saying about perhaps there being something within anarchism which makes it adaptable to either like reformist or just like liberal ideologies. So I also work in animal studies, and a lot of the people that I'm quite critical of very easily or seemingly without much thought describe themselves as anarchists. in the sense that they are, and this kind of touches on some of the things that we've spoken about today as well, in the sense that they're like committed anti-anthropocentrism. They talk about how their ideologies are therefore non-hierarchical or non-domineering, and in that sense they then describe themselves as anarchist, in spite of themselves almost never engaging with, at least to my mind, any actual substantive anarchist theory. And I think what's especially noticeable about their work is that they almost never engage with Kropotkin, but they're talking about animal studies. So I think what I found especially useful about about the last few days of this conference is, again, being fairly being new to all of this, but also having a lot of those ideas actually grounded in the theory of Kropotkin, rather than just vague appeals to we're anarchists because we're anthropocentric. So yeah, I guess that's just more thanking everyone for their papers and helping me understand that.
I want to add to what Billy said as well. I think when me and Billy discussed his PhD before, a lot of these people aren't very like overtly anti-capitalist as well, which if I'm saying that correctly, which I think is another way in which, and obviously well, maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I think there are people who would describe themselves as anarchists who believe in kind of a free market anarchism or anarcho-capitalism, these kind of things. We can debate for a long time if they are anarchists or not. But I think that the people that Billy is talking about wouldn't describe themselves that way. But I think they're not challenging capitalism, but only charging hierarchy in a kind of vague way, is something that like is very like amenable to capitalism, because they can accept funding and they can, support certain businesses, and effectively their view on capitalism can be quite liberal. And I think this is just another way in which it can be accepted and subsumed into like a very moderate political structure. Ben's got his hand up.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't know whether I would call myself an anarchist either, or a Marxist, or what I would call myself. But I have really enjoyed meetings with the International Marxist Humanist Organization that builds more out of the works of Raya Dunayevskaya and different Marxists who are more focused on like the young Marx, which I'm discovering is now its own whole huge form of disagreement among Marxists, young or old Marx. But but the interesting thing is that this particular Marxist tendency focuses on the withering away of the state, and essentially the tenets, like the vision of the state post-revolution, post-worker control, is worker cooperatives, right, like direct democracy, like community self-governance, like everything anarchism, anarcho-federalism, anarcho-communism describes. It's like, oh, the Marxist humanists are also describing the exact same system, and so I think it is interesting that a lot of these like left ideologies that assume very specific labels are really describing a very similar worldview. And I would add on to that. I mean, part of what I find, I mean, anarchism, if it describes a relationship with the state, as opposed to like left anarchism or like libertarian socialism, would technically be inclusive of anarcho-capitalism. So I think a lot of like anarchism can lend itself to a really like libertarian me first ideology. And sometimes that's visible even in the foundational writings, where it's like, we believe man is like, the individual is first, and it's, I don't know that I'm curious to hear what other people have to say about that. Like, does anarchism overemphasize, or I guess traditional classic anarchism overemphasize the individual and individual liberty at the expense of, the community or broader political critique.
Interesting point. Pascal talked a little bit about the individual in Kropotkin, right? And she presented him as absolutely opposed to the very category of individual, kind of federations all the way through to the level of the cell, basically, to the level of organs and so on. So maybe that critique would apply far less to this particular strand of anarchism. But yeah, it's an interesting aspect. And I just wanted to briefly bring in Stephen Becker's comment, who notes that corporate sponsorship is rife in municipal networks, peer-to-peer, new horizontalism espousing political organizations, and also observes that many people who describe themselves as anarchists rushed to support Corbyn's kindly social imperialism, as he calls it. Okay. Dimitri notes that anarchism can even expand into improving home economies. I don't know if you would like to expand on that, Dimitri?
I think there's there is this movement of home improvement for people who want to learn how to cook better, how to garden better, and so on, which is called Martat. I think there's at least one other Finnish speaker on this thing, so maybe they can explain better. But it's been started back in the 19th century, and now there is an anarchist version of that, which is pretty much about going cooking together and gardening together and such things like that, and they call themselves anarchist Martat, which is just how wide and far since the times when anarchism had its public image associated primarily with bombs and explosions has come. You know what I mean? Thank you.
But also pretty far from this economic reorganization, which is also always really strong in Kropotkin's work, right? I mean, yeah, you don't think so? Okay. I was struck, by the way, by the role of the state. I think that you also mentioned, Bennett, and that also would be important for these ecological issues that you certainly talked about, Maria, and that you mentioned, Billy. And I think that that's kind of a crucial aspect of anarchism in confronting, in questions of confronting environmental crisis beyond or without the state, because in many the appeal to solutions seems to be addressed to states or state actors in many cases. Zoran points out that early anarchism, like Proudhon's, was more open to an overly individualistic view, but we should remember that even contemporaneously, Dijak was calling him, I presume Proudhon, out for his views on women. Yes. Yeah. So the question of individualism versus these social modes of organization is really crucial here, I think.
I was saying before as well, sorry, I looked away for a second, you might have already said this, but I think Kropotkin was kind of, he basically, like Proudhon, is the most individualistic of those anarchists, and I think Bakunin is somewhere in the middle, and then Kropotkin is, like you said before, I don't know if you necessarily agree there is no individual, maybe I've read that, maybe you've read that somewhere, but like, certainly the community is like incredibly important, and I guess that was why he used the term anarchist communism, whereas I don't think that, maybe Bakunin coined the term actually, but certainly Proudhon would never have used anarchist communism as a term. And obviously the implication being that we are anarchists, we are individuals, but we're also a member of the commune. And just before we go to Michael, I just want to say as well that what I always found very uncomfortable about Proudhon, who has a lot of very deplorable opinions, but is the founder of anarchism, is that obviously all of us now, very few of us are like Proudhonites, and if we are, we often say, but not the horrible stuff he said. But Kropotkin in his lifetime only ever spoke fondly of Proudhon in my experience. I can't remember any time I ever read him say, oh, he's great, but he's also a massive racist and misogynist and anti-Semite.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the discussion here on individualism and so the classics, where First, I would say I don't know exactly. I don't think it was Bakunin, but it was I think it's someone in Switzerland around that time who came up with the term anarchist communism or anarcho-communism. Bakunin more so being a collectivist. And I think that's one of the main points where you can see a strong disagreement between Kropotkin and Bakunin, where Kropotkin is on the side of the collective, even more so, ironically, considering the term, where Kropotkin is very critical of labor vouchers, for instance, which is something that Bakunin still incorporates. Whereas Kropotkin, as we've seen, I can't remember currently. It was the discussion on. So I can't remember. Oh yeah, sorry. It was Marx talk on Marc Lauzon's talk on social physiology of value, where it came forward very strongly that Kropotkin kind of rejects the idea of individual creation of value and being paid in whatever form for that. But I also wanted to point out that I can't remember the text right now, but Kropotkin does speak of individualism, and he says he is in some ways an individualist, but what he means by that is that he rejects liberal individualism, or what he says has wrongly been called individualism, and he does think that we should have a greater form of individualism, but which can only be founded in communism, which can only exist if we have the collective first. So society comes first, and on that basis, we can. I think that also kind of connects to what Ola's been saying quite strongly.
Does it, Ola?
Yes, it does. Kropotkin's he has a tripartite theory of biology as mutual aid, the solidarity, the instincts. But he's typically criticized for being seen that our animal nature is to be good, but that's not what he's saying. He says we have instincts that make us seek company of others, where social behavior comes natural to us, but it can still go in many different directions. To be good, we need to have a human political society, which he then calls justice and equality. So that's where the collective comes in. That is not morality to him. That's just the next step. Then morality is which is for him basically the same as individuality. Individuality is the free expression that can come after that, after all our needs are fulfilled. Then when we have a society of communism, then individuality can flourish. So yeah, it's 3 steps.
Briefly bring in Maria on this, because you mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin briefly as one example of making anarchist traditions consonant with new materialism, and also kind of tackling this question of the individual and individual morality in even fully developed anarchist societies that she describes. Do you think that maybe her thought and also her fiction would be a good interlocutor for what we've just been discussing here?
It's a question for me, yes. Okay. Yes, I mentioned Ursula Le Guin, and I finished one article about the connection between Ursula Le Guin and new materialisms. And I have made a textological analysis with Donna Haraway texts and Jane Bennett texts and Bruno Latour, who doesn't say anything about Ursula Le Guin, but he quotes her. And many of them quote her, but they don't say it. I don't know why. And I have some ideas. For example, Donna Haraway's Manifest of Kyborgs was published in Marxist publisher house. So I think maybe they didn't want to to see the mentioning of anarchist authors. I don't know. So that's a strange idea. But really, Ursula Le Guin says much of that new materialisms and actor network theory will repeat later. And what about the individual morality and subjectivity? Yes, she is an anarchist, and for her, it's a very important question. But even just repeating her all these conceptions, they try to repeat also her intention, like marking the individuality, but they just don't say that it's something about anarchism. So they don't use the individuality like in liberal sense anymore, in neoliberal sense, as you have said already. So like it's in a Stirnerian sense, I think, like Ursula Le Guin does it. But it's a strange connection. And I think the new materialisms are quite anarchic in this way, even if they call themselves Marxist or post-Marxist. I don't know how they call themselves, but they tend to. We can see it. Yes, but from my point of view, it's like the receiving the Bakunin's ideas through the many filters and the reception of these ideas into new epistemological prisms. So even if they don't call it, it is there. It is inside already. And that's why I think they have it inside, and we should just name the things with their names. So we should mention anarchism and call it with its name inside of these conceptions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. And maybe also kind of re-anarchize them in the process. I mean, Kropotkin not only supporting them, but also maybe adding a political dimension that they lost.
Yes, it was the main
maybe
conclusion of my article, what you have just said. Thank you. So the politicizing of new materialisms that tend to lose their political dimension without the anarchic revision. So they just can stay in the golden cage of academia without the politicizing through anarchist perspective. But we should connect the anarchist perspective in political sense and the intellectual perspective of new materialisms that were grown from Ursula Le Guin's conception, just to make it very fruitful, or very constructive for the future, maybe. Okay.
Billy, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of just linking a bit about what Maria was saying to what Bennett was saying earlier, especially in relation to the early Marx and I guess efforts by Marxist humanists to try and salvage something within Marx before he develops historical materialism in 1845. There's a book called by Thomas Nail called Marx in Motion, which attempts to read the early Marx, so for the structuralist, pre the epistemological break, it attempts to read the early Marx as a new materialist. Yeah, Marx in Motion by Thomas Nail. I didn't get too much from it, but I just thought, it links together the two things that you're talking about.
Okay, quick notes from the chat. Ola reminds us of identity politics as something useful, as we can see with the Combahee River Collective. So identity politics have a role to play in these types of activism. Pardon?
That would be Stephen.
Oh no, Soren replied to Stephen and kind of defended this notion of an identity as a politically useful tool, as I understand it. Ola gave us a really good quote from Kropotkin. The principle of equality sums up the teachings of moralists, but it also contains something more. This something more is respect for the individual. So this issue that we just talked about and that you showed us in slightly more detail. And Soren and Sean also remind us that we can find instances in which Kropotkin takes a firm stand against anti-Semitism, if I understand it correctly. And he was also pretty well received in Jewish anarchist circles, wasn't he? I mean, that was kind of mentioned in passing in some of the talks. All right.
Yeah, when we were just talking about academia as well, I was going to add one last point in that, I can't remember if it connected to what we were talking about, sorry, but basically that, like, I think there's some good work on how anarchism and academia are quite incompatible, because academia is very hierarchical. You know, heads of departments, there's quite a lot of tiers. And nowadays, as it's being incorporated into capitalism, it's got even more incompatible with anarchism, I would say. And I don't know if I fully agree with that. I think obviously you can still be an anarchist academic. I think it just becomes a very difficult relationship. And I think it's worth noting that Kropotkin refused on more than one occasion an academic position. And at least on one occasion at Cambridge, he refused it because he wasn't allowed to continue his political work if he took it.
I think, yeah, just adding on to that. Am I adding on to it? I think I'm adding on to it. I think that there's something really incompatible with the university and I don't know, like just like living a happy life, in the sense that, like, you know, the university, I think increasingly is just commodifies knowledge, and so it's interesting to think about what possibilities education could have if universities were decommodified. I mean, you could think about it even in the sense of disciplinarity, right? Like, people go to grad school, become an expert in this field, presumably because it makes the value of their labor more profitable, right? So you specialize in astrophysics with the intention of having a career in astrophysics. The idea of being a bus driver with an astrophysics degree is entirely incompatible and really kind of fiscally impossible. It would be irresponsible for a bus driver to go to grad school, learn about physics, knowing full well that they want to continue being a bus driver, which to me is like, that's incompatible with the world I want to live in. I want to live in a world where a bus driver can study whatever they want, you know, like they work 8 hours a day or however long. I mean, shit, with like technology, I mean, if workers control the means of production, who knows how long people would actually have to work in a day, like 5 hours maybe. And then you have what? Then you study, then you learn. And this is where it's like, I feel like in addition to the abolition of hierarchy within academia, both within the academic space, but also between the academic space and the kind of unlearned, like common man space, there's also a need to get rid of this really like profit-driven disciplinary study where everything you do is about maximizing your value as a worker. And I think it's exciting to think about what that could be like, even if it probably won't be like that.
Ole?
Yeah, just to relate to that, I currently live in Iceland, but I grew up in Denmark. And one thing that I'm missing here in Iceland is a thing that in Denmark, since 100 years ago, there was a strong movement, actually a double movement, both in the labor movement in the cities and also farmers, of creating educational spaces for just learning for your own sake, bringing literature to, making philosophy, literature, art, etc., accessible to workers and farmers, started 100 years ago. And to relate that to Kropotkin, he started out doing the same thing before he was an anarchist. What I did want to say was in relation to Maria. I think what has very good point in new materialism and also post-structuralist thoughts in general have been struggling to insist that they are Marxists or that they are, come out of a Marxist tradition, and it's often a little forced. Like I think, like when you read Deleuze, he's clearly an anarchist. Like Deleuze's philosophy is anarchist, and his critiques of Marxism are anarchist critiques. He even, like the word war machine that Deleuze uses is Kropotkin uses the same word for the working class should be a war machine. I think it came out of both anarchism being a taboo word, but also they came out of a tradition where you had to identify yourself as a Marxist, even if you had critiques that were fundamentally not Marxist. Which maybe is okay because it means that we don't have to have these, like we can overlap with each other. But it's true. Like this is Catherine Malabou is raising this, and she's part of the working with new materialism too, and she's like, it hasn't yet been philosophized how many of these ideas are actually anarchists and overlap with anarchism. I'll put a link here to the book that's coming out, but she's raising the same points.
Okay. It seems to me that we've ranged pretty far and wide across some of the thoughts that were raised in the course of the conference. And something that we will maybe consider later is also kind of the different disciplinary perspectives that we have, within academia on Kropotkin and the difference in the course of the conference. For today, we would like to wrap up now without any pathos-laden final words, just to indicate to you that we are considering a publication of the talk that we heard. And sorry, I was on there for a second. We haven't quite settled on the format of that publication yet, whether it's a special issue of a journal, some open access venue. So if any of you has a suggestion there, give us your mutual aid and write us an email. The conference email address will be sustained for a long while. And we'll be enthused to see as many of you as possible in this possible publication project, which we will try to get on its way relatively soon, hopefully. Apart from that, we have some stats on the conference which you might be interested in that Tom sent earlier. We have done quite a bit of international work here with participants from all over the world. I can't find the particular regions now. United Kingdom, United States, Germany, Netherlands, Russia, and many participants from other places as well. I hope Bennett isn't listening, that we're classifying everyone else as other now, but it doesn't specify further.
Outside of the colonial core.
We're going to do no correct life and the wrong one. Okay, Billy, Adeline, Sean, any final notes, issues, demands?
I guess I just wanted to repeat what I said in the chat. Thank you so much for making the conference what it was, and especially to the organizers, the speakers, and the watchers. And I also said, always much love for the silent lurkers, because I'm often the person who is silently watching but not comfortable enough to comment. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.